Chapter 3, 1966. My first two visits to Atlanta were at age 3 and 4, traveling with my mother to visit her side of the family. The first time was a Christmas visit in 1956. I can remember being on the plane during that trip. The second time was in early 1958 because my grandfather, Rogelio Alonzo, was ill. I can actually recall going into the old Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta and seeing him wave to me from his bed across the large room. Although kids weren't allowed on the patient floor, when I saw him I yelled, "Papa!" I'm told that I then bolted across the room to see him. Evidently the doctors and nurses were moved by it and decided to give the little kid a break, so they opted to let me stay there briefly. On a return trip to the hospital after a day or so, my mother entered the room and found his bed empty. My grandfather, my mother's father, had just passed away. That was January of 1958. Word through the family had it that he was a jovial fellow, as well as politely obnoxious. His nickname was the Storm, which was totally coincidental when I related to the stage moniker Hurricane that I was assigned to me later on by some musician pals. It would have been nice if Rogelio could have hung around longer, so I could have gotten to know him. His side of the family dates back to Spain by way of Cuba. I was named after him, Rogelio Alonzo, pronounced Rogelio. He had two brothers, Manuel and Alfredo. According to travel records, Rogelio and Manuel came to America by way of Key West and Tampa, Florida. They eventually took up residence in Brunswick, Georgia. Not much information can be found on Alfredo other than the fact that he was a Cuban diplomat, a consulate to England to be exact. Although the information is sketchy, it appears that Alfredo was assassinated by the Cuban Batista regime. The only clue I had was from one photograph of him with my mother's writing on it saying, "My father's brother." It must have been a sore subject because I never heard word one about it. Nothing. The only other mention of it was on the back of a group photograph that appears to have been taken at a formal gathering in England, complete with all of the British pageantry. The note stated that Alfredo's wife had his body transported back to England. After that horrific event, it appears that Rogelio and Manuel couldn't get out of Cuba fast enough. After settling in Brunswick, Georgia, the two brothers would marry two sisters, Fannie Mae Jones, my grandmother, and Florence Jones, respectively. It never occurred to me, but I was told that these two merging culture relationships may have raised some eyebrows back in the day. After all, it was the early 20th century. These unions were probably considered interracial on a higher level than anyone would be concerned about today. This would be a real precursor to the marriage of Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, whose celebrity status would draw great publicity. Eventually, they would help to clear the way for the easing of future tensions about similar relationships. Rogelio and Fannie Mae had 3 children, Dorilla, Bebe, and Walter Alonzo. This crew would be considered the Atlanta Alonzos. Dorilla, my mother, would eventually meet my dad, Brooks Wilson Jr., while working in New Jersey. Manuel and Florence would have 3 daughters, Nina, Miriam, and Barbara, and they would all be known as the Jacksonville Alonzos. They are my double first cousins. My great-grandmother from Brunswick, Georgia, was Nina P. Clubb, the one that got it all started. She was the daughter of ship pilot Captain James Clubb, who is most noted to have piloted into port at Brunswick the Wanderer, which was the last slave ship to arrive in Georgia. As large ships would arrive at their destinations after a long journey, they would need to know exactly where to go to dock. A ship pilot's job was to go out and bring them in. The story goes that when he was checking and securing the ship before steering it in, he opened the cargo hold and was appalled at what he saw. It was at capacity, with people being held in decrepit conditions that were being brought to the U.S. to be sold as slaves. I was told that this saddened, sickened, and enraged him all at the same time. Although while being in a situation totally beyond his control, he could do nothing more than just close the hatch and continue to bring the ship in. I was told the full story back in the early 80s by my grandmother, Fannie Mae, and her half-sister, my great-aunt, Pauline Walton. She herself had married into the Walton family, direct descendants of George Walton, one of the Georgia signers of the Declaration of Independence. My mom's fondest memories were of spending the summers at Grand's house in Brunswick. My mother, Dorilla Wilson, was born in Greenville, South Carolina, but grew up in Atlanta. She was living and working for the U.S. Air Force in New Jersey when she met my dad, Brooks Wilson Jr. Her father, Rogelio Alonzo, that you read about earlier, was in the tobacco business and would relocate for work on several occasions. Mom and he were very close, so she would move along with him to help him out, hence the reason for her being in New Jersey. While working there, she met Brooks, who was 11 years younger than she. He was smitten with her, and after a period of I don't know how long, he said that if she didn't marry him, he would freeze over. Dorilla was already a well-established professional and articulate career woman, so I think she may have been wondering who this pipsqueak was that kept bothering her. She had nice things such as furniture, a TV, and monogrammed clothes. Although Brooks was that much younger, he was extremely intelligent and was already working as a draftsman. Although he was 11 years younger than she, he had wisdom and carried himself in a way far beyond his years. I have no idea how long their dating period or courtship was, but all I do know is that she was 33 and he was 22 when they got married in 1951. In their photo taken after getting married at the JP's office in Newark, New Jersey, Mom looks as sophisticated as ever. My dad looks like a little kid clutching that ever-present Pall Mall cigarette that would eventually take him out. I showed up 2 years later in July of 1953, the same month and year that Elvis Presley walked into Sun Records in Memphis to record a song for his mother. I said it in one of my songs, Millennium Blues, that I knew they were up to something, so I stopped by to see. Jump ahead 8 years from 1958 to 1966 when my mom and I made a return trip to Atlanta to visit family. At 12 years old, I would spend my 13th birthday in late July that year in Georgia. I hadn't seen my grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins in almost a decade. By this time, my older and beautiful cousin Charlotte was 16 and driving. How cool was that? The last time I had seen her, she was 8 years old, but unbeknownst to me, now she had blossomed into a breathtakingly beautiful blonde teenager. I got to hang around with her for some of her adolescent adventures, and let me tell you, there were a few. A good one was the time she let her friend drive her car while switching places to drive a boyfriend's brand new 1966 Mustang. How she explained to her father, my Uncle Mac, the dent made on her vehicle when her friend rear-ended the Mustang, I'll never know. The Mustang was unscathed. To this day, my late cousin Charlotte gets full credit for showing me how to get away with stuff. Her twin sister Charlene was the weaker twin. Although she was what would have been referred today as special needs, the family never treated her any differently than any other sibling. They loved her dearly. Charlene is one of the sweetest people you would ever want to meet. In the midst of a sea of family dysfunctionality that spanned generations, she remained the wonderfully centered same person through it all more than anyone else in the family. That summer, my cousin Maxine, the oldest of all the siblings, took me and a few other cousins to Six Flags over Georgia. That was a great day. Their brother, my cousin Rusty, took me to my first Major League Baseball game for my 13th birthday that summer. It was in the new Atlanta Stadium during the Braves' first season. The team had just moved to Atlanta from Milwaukee in 1965. At this writing, the Braves are celebrating 50 years in Atlanta. He really had no idea how big a deal this was for me at the time. Unfortunately, he passed away suddenly during the writing of this book in early 2015, removing the chance of his ever reading this. I'm glad I took the opportunity to thank him several times during our visits over the years. It is comforting to know that he did realize my appreciation of how big this experience was for me. It was big because my folks would never take me to a New York Yankees or New York Mets game when I was a kid. I'm probably the only kid from Jersey that never attended either a Yankees or Mets game. They just didn't want to deal with the traffic along with the ordeal of just getting there. When finally attending games at Yankee Stadium and Shea Stadium years later at age 50 while on the road, their reasoning was totally understandable. One highlight of that first Braves game back in 1966 was seeing Felipe Alou hit his 23rd home run of the season, and another was seeing newly acquired Braves catcher Joe Torre play that night. That memory would surface later while working for the superstation WTBS broadcast crews of both the Atlanta Braves and the Atlanta Hawks in the 80s and 90s. It brings to mind a couple of baseball events that really stand out. One would occur exactly 20 years later after that Braves game in 1966. The other would happen 4 years later in 1990. 20 years later in 1986, Joe Torre unceremoniously left his managing position with the Atlanta Braves. One of my freelance jobs at that time was working for Atlanta talk radio station WGST as a remote producer. Although I had just been hired by CNN, there was still some local radio freelance work keeping me busy for a while. While Joe had just left the Braves, he still had several local radio talk show programs to finish out. The last several shows were remote broadcasts at a North Atlanta sports bar. Arriving early to set up my audio gear for the live remote talk show, Joe Torre soon arrived to complete the first of his remaining shows. He was very laid back and not too concerned about having been just fired from the Atlanta Braves. His main concern was about his brother Frank, who was ill at the time. Joe was such a nice guy. He was very cordial, enjoying fielding questions on the air from listeners. During the broadcast, he pulled out a large cigar that really smelled great when he lit it up. In mentioning that it had a pleasant aroma, he said he would bring me one to the next show. The next night, Joe came in dressed in a nice sports jacket and proceeded to pull out a huge cigar and hand it to me. We had a great time doing the show that night. There I was, smoking a cigar with Joe Torre while producing his radio show. During a break, I mentioned having seen him catch 20 years before at my first Major League game, and that was when I became a Braves fan. No camera phones or social media in those days, but what a great memory of a great day hanging with Joe Torre. He had no idea what his next career move would be, but he would later come back to clean the Braves' clock as Yankees manager in a World Series. The summer of 2014 would find Joe being inducted to the Baseball Hall of Fame on my 61st birthday, no less. It really made me feel good to witness that. I wrote him a letter congratulating him on the award and for his great success in the 20 or so years since he left the Braves. The other story took place in 1990. My mother-in-law was dying of cancer. On my off days from CNN, the opportunity was there to grab overtime with WTBS on the Braves broadcast crew. My mother-in-law, Myrtle Watson, was a big Dale Murphy fan. Before leaving for work this day, she jokingly asked me to give Dale a big hug for her. I told her laughingly that I didn't think Murph would appreciate that. It simply didn't register as a possibility at first, but little did I know. While walking into Atlanta Fulton County Stadium before the game, the thought hit me. Looking up at the lights and realizing that if I didn't seize this day for my mother-in-law, there would be no forgiving myself. Here I was wearing stadium credentials with full access anywhere in the facility. Why couldn't I do this? My job was working audio for TV in the Braves dugout. The first person and the perfect one to run into was official Braves photographer, the late Walter Victor. After telling him of my mother-in-law's unfortunate condition, I hoped he might have some suggestions. Since we were both on the field at the dugout, he said that Dale always arrived first and would be out of the locker room shortly. Walter had me pick up a couple of wayward baseballs that were lying around the dugout. He said to just tell Murph the situation when he came out. I did just that. The whole story, how she was his biggest fan, how she didn't have much time left. In passing on her request for me to give him a big hug, we both lightheartedly agreed that his signature on the baseball would work just as well. He signed that ball to my mother-in-law, Myrtle Watson. Not one to blow a great opportunity, he also signed the other one for me. Upon receiving the signed baseball the next day, she said it was the nicest thing anyone had ever done for her. It made me feel good to make that happen. She passed away 2 days later. My first wife, Ginger, still has the original baseball signed for her mother to this day. Mine is still with me as well. These two adventures were nothing short of getting as close as possible to my childhood dream of being a baseball player without actually putting on the uniform. But all that was years away, and not even in my wildest dreams yet as a 12-year-old on his first return to Georgia in 8 years since age 4. Having been born and raised in New Jersey, the South was a different world. People were actually polite there. When you looked a stranger in the eye here, they said hi. If you did that in New Jersey, the person glaring back at you would say, "What the F are you looking at?" The South had a different feel. I liked it. Another appealing factor was that the age to drive in Georgia was 16, unlike the eternally distant age of 17 in New Jersey. For just that reason, I vowed to return to Georgia or bust so I could drive at 16. Atlanta was cool. It was tough returning to New Jersey after those 2 weeks. When Mom and I arrived home after our summer visit to Georgia, unknowingly things were about to change. The town of Keansburg, New Jersey didn't have a high school in 1967. Up until that point, students were being bused to Middletown Township High School. That was the norm. At the same time, the town began construction on Keansburg High School. For the year in between, Keansburg Public School students would be riding the bus to 2 different surrounding area high schools. The Burg, as it was known, didn't have a good reputation in the region. It was a small, isolated, seasonal, welfare and blue-collar town on the Raritan Bay. It was also the first resort and the first beach one could get to when heading south to the Jersey Shore from the city. On the upside, summers in the Burg were wonderful for a kid. While there was some serenity in the seasonal solitude, the winters could still be somewhat depressing. Somehow my mother got wind of a derogatory comment made by a teacher from one of the high schools selected to take on new high school students from Keansburg. Supposedly, this teacher actually said, "So now they're bringing me more trash from Keansburg." This infuriated my mother to the extreme. This got her seriously thinking of alternatives for me for my own good. In the fall of 1966, I would enter the 8th grade for my final year at Keansburg Public School. A few days before school started, my folks dropped a bombshell on me. They informed me that they were actually thinking of sending me to a military school to get me away from Keansburg. She vowed not to deal with people such as the teacher who made the lousy statement. Knowing that they were looking out for my best interest, I still freaked out. Did they want to get rid of me? All sorts of thoughts were going through my 13-year-old mind. I ran out of the house crying and went around the corner to a vacant lot where I used to play and hid out. After calming down somewhat, a light bulb went on. Knowing that it wouldn't be possible, but with Georgia still on my mind, I went back home and asked my folks to consider sending me to Atlanta. That would be acceptable. Knowing that it would never happen, what a shock it was when they liked the idea. So began the research into my future high school education in Georgia. Since my mother was from Atlanta, she remembered Georgia Military Academy. There were fond memories for her seeing the GMA cadets marching at various events throughout her youth. She thought it would be wonderful if I could attend that school. After inquiring to apply for admission, the catalog we received showed that the school had been renamed Woodward Academy after its founder, Colonel John Charles Woodward. Following all of the required paperwork and red tape, a letter of acceptance to Woodward Academy eventually showed up. I spent the rest of 1966 and the first part of 1967 literally counting the days until I would be heading south. Graduating in the 8th grade class of '67 from Keensburg Public School was a sweet moment, but my adventure was just beginning.